So this is part two of the 1960 election. In part one, we looked at John F. Kennedy, the Democratic candidate for the 1960 presidential election. And in this part, we're going to look at the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon. So who is Richard Nixon? Richard Nixon is completely different from John F. Kennedy, politically and on a personal level as well. Nixon was born in Yorba Linda, California in 1913. He was born into a poor Quaker family. That meaning that he grew up with some pretty strict religious rules on things that he could and couldn't do. He was quoted saying that he grew up poor, but the glorious part about it was that he never knew that they were poor until he got older. His brother had a lot of health issues going on throughout their life, meaning that he had to make sacrifices himself. For example, he was offered a grant for tuition at Harvard after he graduated from high school, but he couldn't go. He couldn't go because he had to stay back and help his father run their family grocery store. Because Nixon was unable to attend Harvard because he had to stay back and help his family run their store, he attended Whittier College, which was in his new hometown. And while at Whittier, he excelled academically. He excelled on the debate team, and he even played a little bit of sports as well. But he would get this kind of moniker as a hard worker at Whittier College, and he would graduate and eventually look into going to law school, where he received a scholarship to go to Duke University, which is in North Carolina, very, very good school. After he graduated from Duke, he would move back and have a career as a lawyer. As time goes on, and right around the beginning of the Second World War, he would move with his wife to Washington, where he worked for the Price administration when he worked in the area of tire rationing. He didn't particularly enjoy that job working for the Office of Price Administration, so he joined the Navy in 1942, and he would go on for a few years to have a pretty well decorated officer's career in the Navy throughout the war. After the war, he returns back to California and actually serves as a congressman within their state Congress or within their state legislature, and eventually does start moving his political career in the right direction and becomes a senator. Now, he's a senator from 1950 to 1953. That's when he first kind of receives that nickname that's going to follow him along for the rest of his career, is Tricky Dick. And people called him that apparently because of his campaign tactics and how he went about doing those things. He did take a hard line stance on communism, but still was friendly with Joseph McCarthy, and eventually is going to be one of the finalists for Dwight Eisenhower's vice president position. Now, Dwight Eisenhower wasn't necessarily huge on Richard Nixon right away. He wasn't sold on Nixon immediately. There was other people that he could have chosen. But when he looked at Nixon, he saw a guy that, like we said before, had a hard line on communism, which was really important at the time. And he also saw that he's from California, and he had a really big following in California. Now, if any of you guys remember how the Electoral College works, you get votes based off of population. So having a guy with a strong following in California, which at the time had some of the most electoral votes that one state could hope for, and then today they have the most, it seemed like a good choice. And as time goes on, we're going to see that it's going to become more and more difficult for Republicans to win California. So with Nixon in his hip pocket, he is going to be able to hopefully win California and win a lot of electoral votes. Not only does Dwight Eisenhower, we'll call him later Ike, use him for that, but he also uses Nixon to kind of portray any sort of negative things they might be bringing to the table. Eisenhower campaigned on all positive things. And when there was any questions really about negative things that might follow them around or things they might run into, Nixon is kind of the one that's going to deal with those controversial things. He is going to serve as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower for 8 years. So when you look at the difference between Nixon and Kennedy, there is just this huge difference, right? Kennedy was kind of born into this royal, wealthy family, um, and eventually, turned into this politician. While Nixon was, from a very humble background and is really going to have a lot of stops along the way before he can rise to political greatness. So I really like this election because the candidates are so different. And then the next video, we are going to look at the election and we're going to see who wins and we're going to see why those people win and how that election changes politics and how it changes how elections work and how people campaign and things like that forever. Um, so I hope that you enjoyed it. I know it's a little bit shorter than the last one, but just a little bit of background on Richard Nixon.